Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the channel. I've been wanting to make a video about the UFC Apex for a while now, and I figured with the break in UFC action, now was the perfect time to make a video regarding the UFC Apex, and I'm going to give you guys a definitive answer regarding a question that I've seen pop up time and time again. And the question is, when will the UFC stop doing fights at the UFC Apex? I'm going to give you a definitive answer in this video. And also, I'm going to discuss something regarding the future of the UFC Apex that I've not seen MMA Fighting discuss, that I've not seen MMA Junkie or ESPN or any of the notable, journalists on Twitter who cover MMA. I've not seen any of them discuss. And I believe if you follow the breadcrumbs, you can make an educated guess on the future of the UFC Apex, and I'm going to share that with you guys in this video. I'm also going to talk about the background of the UFC Apex, as well as reasons I absolutely despise the UFC Apex. If you watched my video on Marlon Vera versus Corey Sandhagen, which I'll link down in the description, I talked about it briefly in that video as well. But guys, do me a favor, if you enjoy videos like this, make sure to like the video, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. I would greatly appreciate it. So first off, the UFC Apex was built for the Ultimate Fighter and Dana White's Contender Series. They weren't ever planning to have UFC pay-per-views there or UFC Fight Night cards there. They were never planning on doing that. But in 2020, basically when the world shut down, they had UFC 248, which was Israel Adesanya versus Joel Romero. That was in front of a crowd at an arena. And then the following week, they had Charles Oliveira versus Kevin Lee, which was in Brazil, but they ended up having no crowd because of everything that was going on in the world. After that, there was a couple canceled events. The UFC decided, how are we going to move forward with the business? And essentially what they said is, we're going to hold events at the UFC Apex. We already have all the infrastructure we need there to televise the events. And basically, we don't need a crowd. We're just going to hold events at the UFC Apex. So after UFC 248 and that one Fight Night card afterwards, they did every single event at the UFC Apex, even pay-per-views. And up until April of 2021, that's essentially what we got. And then in April of 2021, we got UFC 261, Kamaru Usman, Jorge Masvidal 2. And this was the UFC's big return to being in front of massive crowds. And they decided from there, okay, we're going to start doing all the pay-per-views in front of massive crowds. We're going to go to different places. We're going to be in Las Vegas, T-Mobile Arena. And they've not had a pay-per-view at the UFC Apex since I think it was UFC 260, because 261 was the first one in front of a crowd. And after that, people were wondering, okay, when are they getting rid of the UFC Apex Fight Night cards? And essentially, we haven't really got an answer. The media's asked a couple times. And in 2022, they ventured out and done some Fight Night cards in, certain places, Texas. And, I think they've done, they did the one in Orlando. And there's multiple other ones. But in 2022 still, they've still held 21 events at the UFC Apex. And for me, I absolutely hate the Apex. So I've been really wondering, when is the UFC going to stop doing these Apex events? And the reasons I absolutely hate the Apex, one is the lack of crowd. I know this isn't a massive deal, but it ruins the viewing experience not to have those massive crowd reactions. It just doesn't feel as fun. Then on top of that, and this is a major reason as well, is the UFC hides in the Apex when they're putting on shitty Fight Night cards. I mean, you go back to November. I mean, we really had Kennedy and Chukwu versus Ion Cutelaba as a main event. And I know people are going to say, well, Derek Lewis, Sergey Spivak was canceled. This card was garbage to begin with. It was absolute garbage. This was a terrible card, even if the main event stayed intact. Then you have events like Mackenzie Dern versus Yan Xiaonan, or Alexa Grasso versus Viviane Araujo. And the reason the UFC can have events that are this terrible, and I could go through the entire card and tell you how terrible it was. I'm going to spare you all those details. But the reason the UFC can do this is because they don't have to worry about selling tickets. And I know we've had some okay UFC Apex cards. The Sean Strickland, Jared Cannonier card was pretty solid for UFC Apex event. But the UFC doesn't care about selling tickets. They only have, I'm not sure what the exact capacity is. It's like 100 or 200 max. They give away a lot of those tickets, and then they sell some to fans for like $2,000 a ticket. And they hide behind that because they're like, okay, well, we have to produce these events anyway. We're cutting out some of the overhead costs. We're hosting it at our own Apex where we have the infrastructure in place. And we ain't got to worry about selling tickets. We've already sold this fight card, whatever it is, whatever number it may be. We've already sold it to ESPN Plus. So they don't care who's the main event. They don't need to sell tickets. You think they're doing Mackenzie Dern versus Yan Xiaonan in front of a live crowd? What, are you going to have 3 people buy tickets? You think they're doing Alexa Grasso versus Viviane Araujo in front of a live crowd? How many tickets are they going to sell? I would be surprised if anybody shows up. I mean, I guess for the Mackenzie Dern versus Yan Xiaonan, at least Mark Zuckerberg would show up. But the UFC hides behind this to put on shitty fight night cards, and it's really infuriating. And then the other reason I absolutely hate, I despise the UFC Apex, is because they use a smaller octagon. I mean, we have a 25-foot octagon for the UFC Apex. We have a 30-foot octagon for the regular UFC octagon that they use in arenas. And that doesn't sound like much. But the regular 30-foot UFC octagon is 40% bigger, 44% bigger actually, from the numbers I'm looking at. Then you have the fact that it's 20% wider. I mean, this is a massive amount of space. And what other professional league of any sorts, NFL, MLB, NBA, switches the size of the playing field based on what week it is and where they're at? Could you imagine if the NFL said, you know what, this week we're kind of running low on space. We're going to have a 70-yard field instead of a 100-yard field. Could you imagine? It just seems cheap. It seems embarrassing. And for me, when you have some decent fights in there that, you know, especially when in 2020, when you were having massive fights in there, massive pay-per-views for titles, and you're putting it in a small cage, you know, it can affect the outcomes of fights. And I know some people are saying it's more exciting. I don't know the exact date on that. But I just think it's an embarrassment that they're switching back and forth from a smaller cage to a bigger cage. And I think it's ridiculous because what other sport, what other, you know, NFL, NBA, MLB, anything, none of them would ever switch the size of the playing field based on where they were at. And the reason the UFC does this is because apparently the larger cage does not look right in the Apex. And that's basically it. That's the only reason why. It doesn't look right. It takes up too much space. And essentially they don't have room for it. But this can affect outcomes of fights. You know, if you have a guy who has great footwork, it's going to affect them. Or a guy that's looking for takedowns versus a guy who's looking to use his footwork and circle around the cage. This can drastically affect fights. And I think it's ridiculous that from week to week, you never know what size cage you're fighting in. There's some guys who don't want to fight in the Apex. There's some guys who only want to fight in the Apex. You know, I'm assuming if you're a grappler, you probably want to fight in the Apex because it gives your opponent less space to try to move away from you and avoid the takedowns. And I know some people are going to be in favor of that. I absolutely hate it. I think it's, you know, just cheap and it just makes the UFC look bad. But I'm wondering now with all these factors, and there's a lot of people complaining, you know, the lack of the crowd, the shitty fight night cards, and also the cage side, which I haven't seen a lot of people complaining about, but there's been a portion of people that have been complaining about that. The UFC Apex has kind of fallen out of favor with the fans. A lot of people are like, when are we getting rid of these terrible fight night cards? And I think I have a definitive answer for you guys. And we start off March 11th, 2023, and the UFC is having an event at the theater at the Virgin Hotel. And the reason this is, you know, relevant to the video that I'm talking about the UFC Apex is because why are they having an event there? This hotel does not have a massive capacity. I think it has like a 4,000 capacity for fans. And it's 8 miles away from the UFC Apex. So what exactly is going on there? Why would they do that? They're not going to sell a lot of tickets. You know, they have a small capacity themselves. And it's only 8 miles away from the UFC Apex. Why wouldn't they just do it at the UFC Apex? And the reason they are doing this, and this was originally supposed to be Jamal Hill versus Anthony Smith, but obviously that fight's canceled now. We don't know what the main event is yet. But you're probably wondering, what does a March 11th fight night card at the Virgin Hotels have to do with the UFC Apex? So first off, I've already mentioned that it's only 8 miles away from the UFC Apex. So why are they holding it at such a small venue if they have the UFC Apex 10 minutes away? And I want to take you back to an article from the Sports Business Journal from January 28th of this year. I'll link it down in the description if you want to check it out. And I'm basically reading just little excerpts from it. But the UFC plans to add the ability to host up to 1,000 people and add food and alcohol services, ticket sales, and a souvenir shop to the space. Basically, they're applying to a commission to expand the UFC Apex to be able to host a larger crowd, to have food, alcohol, souvenir shop, ticket sales, like I guess walk-up ticket sales, and also expand parking. And the reason that is super relevant is because I believe what's going on in February and March, around the time they're having that March Fight Night card at the Virgin Hotels, I believe the UFC is having construction done on the UFC Apex. We'll see how long that's going to take. But what all this information tells me is the UFC is going to do Fight Night cards at the UFC Apex long term. I don't believe it's ever going to end. I don't think there's ever going to be a day where the UFC stops doing Fight Night cards at the Apex. That's not saying they're going to do every fight card there. But, I mean, obviously, they've already mixed it up. They've gone to Orlando. They've gone to Texas. They're going to San Antonio in March of next year as well. But I think what they're doing is they're trying to expand this. They're trying to, have the ability to have a larger crowd there because it looks better on TV, for one. Also, fans are complaining about it. And I think the UFC Apex is just going to be something they break out here and there. I think there's going to be multiple events at the UFC Apex per year. They can still hide behind shitty cards because they don't have to worry about a massive amount of ticket sales. And I think this also has to do with the ESPN Plus deal. The reason the UFC was so desperate, and I understand they want to keep their business running and make money in 2020, but the reason the UFC was so desperate to hold events in 2020 when everything crazy was going on is because ESPN is paying them a flat rate for X number of events per year. And that's why sometimes in 2020, they did 2 events in a day because they owe ESPN this number of fights, this number of events for ESPN Plus to make the money that they agreed upon in the contract. And I think what the UFC realized now with using the UFC Apex, they can cut out a lot of overhead costs. They're already getting paid from ESPN. If they already have everything set up, they don't have to pay setup costs. They don't have to pay a fee to the arena. They don't have to share revenue from ticket sales. And if they expand and make these minor changes to the Apex, they can make money off food and alcohol sales. They can sell more tickets. And also they're cutting out of thousands of dollars of overhead costs to go to these different little towns where they're not making a fortune anyway. The majority of their money is coming from the broadcast deal from ESPN and the ad revenue they have that they put, the commercials on there or whatnot. They're not worried about these Fight Night cards and the amount of revenue they make from ticket sales. Obviously, they're still going to have some big Fight Night cards where they go to certain locations. They're going to San Antonio. They went to Orlando. They've gone to, other places for Fight Night cards throughout the year. But essentially, the UFC Apex fight cards are never going to end. They are here to stay. And if you look back at that article, you add it together with the Virgin Hotels Fight Night card in March, I think you can unequivocally say with a certain degree of certainty that I think the UFC Apex is here to stay forever. I'd be shocked if the UFC ever stopped hosting events at the UFC Apex. They hosted 21 events in 2022. Maybe they'll cut down a little bit in 2023 because maybe the first, quarter and a half, they won't be able to have the events there because of the underway construction. But I think probably in 2024, they'll be right back up to 20 and maybe they'll get to 30. And I think for the reasons I've already stated, not worrying about ticket sales, they can hide behind shitty cards and they can easily avoid overhead costs, which probably amount to thousands of dollars. The UFC Apex is here to stay. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you so much for watching.